I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week, we're going to be looking at one of the ultimate movie stars, maybe the most valuable movie star in terms of his connection to intellectual property, but also one of those guys where during the 90s, if you put his face on a poster, it would make money. I'm talking about the ultimate, sort of consummate blockbuster movie star, Harrison Ford. But what I do every single week is look at a movie star's career and break down their career while trying to identify what makes them great, what is their sort of special sauce, their movie star magic that makes them interesting as a movie star. I start off the show by breaking down their career into 3 separate chapters, talking about a defining role in each of those chapters, just so you understand their career and how they sort of have evolved as an actor, and it's just a sort of convenient way to ultimately talk about their sort of overall career. And then in the sort of last third of the video, I try to understand that movie star magic. What is that one thing that in this case Harrison Ford has that other actors that we've already discussed don't have? But jumping into things, starting off with chapter 1, I'm calling this chapter the wise ass, because Harrison Ford pretty much sort of early on has established his persona, his Harrison Ford persona, and particularly when he's sort of younger in this youthful period, he is known as playing a lot of these sort of smart alecky characters. He has a couple of supporting roles early on in The Conversation and American Graffiti, but even Apocalypse Now, but really sort of the opening introduction of Harrison Ford has to be Star Wars, playing Han Solo, and in many ways that sort of archetype carries with him throughout the entire career that he's had, but particularly through this sort of early chapter 1 period where we have this sort of reluctant hero who is sort of willing to make jokes about things and not take things always super seriously, but at the end of the day does what is right. And I would say this chapter pretty much starts off from the beginning of his career up until I'd say probably the Mosquito Coast. And then he has, an ultimate sort of legendary run of Star Wars, of Apocalypse Now, of Indiana Jones and those movies, as well as the, Star Wars movies. And then, like I mentioned already, Apocalypse Now and Blade Runner. I mean, just in terms of movies that have been remade or movies that are sort of in the American canon of modern day blockbusters, Harrison Ford is at the center of many of them. But when talking about a defining role of this period, I had to go with Raiders of the Lost Ark. And, how could you not go with a movie like a Blade Runner or a Star Wars? But for me, or even an underrated movie, which I've talked about on the show, Witness, which is, I think, a great starring vehicle for him. But for the most part, I went with the movie that is the starring vehicle, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, he is Indiana Jones. He helped invent this archetype, which is a prototype for a lot of action heroes, particularly within the 90s. The sort of reluctant hero, the sort of everyman kind of a hero. Let's not forget that Harrison Ford is not a Sylvester Stallone or Schwarzenegger type of a muscular superhero type figure. Dr. Jones is a professor who is also sort of like this adventurer. So that ultimately gives him a sense of believability, because he seems relatable, because he is sort of an everyday guy. So when he goes on these adventures and there's always that, oh no, is he going to get out of it? In the back of your mind, he of course he will, because he's the star of the movie, but you're always sort of tense and you're unsure. And this is a classic sort of instance of that, of the set pieces of him hanging off the side of the car, or him in the opening with the boulder ball. Boulder sort of running, coming towards him. It is a sort of, they're iconic for a reason, and I think Ford is great at emphasizing a lot of that tension, because he is really so great at playing the everyman, that sort of relatable kind of a guy, so that when we do get to these action scenes, we actually see the sort of fear and terror on his face. It makes you believe that he can actually die, he can actually get injured, and therefore your emotional investment in these action scenes are a lot heightened. And Ford in particular is great with those reactions, whether it be him trying to find Marion in the big market there with all the baskets, or even just when he's about to finally get some achievement and the Nazis show up right after. That sort of sense of frustration and fear and tension, which is brilliantly sort of utilized, the close-ups in as Steven Spielberg does in those action sequences. But it is ultimately Ford's facial reacting and acting himself that allows us to be emotionally invested in this character. Then chapter 2, I'm calling this chapter the I'm tired of this chapter, because before Tom Hanks was America's dad, I think it was Harrison Ford, oftentimes portraying that as the sort of idea of American morals and dignity and truth and justice, playing father figures as sort of a regular guy in these sort of insane situations. And in the first sort of chapter there, he was really tied to franchises. He did 3 Indiana Jones movies, he did 3 Star Wars movies, and in this sort of second period here, he does very few franchises, only in Jack Ryan, in which he does a couple of those movies. But for the most part, it's just him on a poster in some sort of action thriller for, like, mature, sort of older action star. And the Jack Ryan movies are a classic example of that in terms of just the sort of persona that Ford ultimately adopted, this sort of moral executor of justice, the sense that he was still sort of a reluctant hero now because of his older age, instead of being sort of too cool for school like in his earlier chapter. He's still that reluctant hero, but in this time he's doing so just because he's too old and kind of tired of this crap, but still he often executes that. But he's always thrust into these situations. He's never volunteering. So in a movie like Frantic or Presumed Innocence or The Fugitive, something's happening to him. His wife goes missing, or he's on the run for killing his wife. There are these instances where he's not necessarily going out and seeking this kind of adventure like he is necessarily in something like Indiana Jones. In this chapter, he is sort of a little bit more reserved, but is still doing it anyways. But that sort of restlessness, that sort of begrudgingness, he still has that. But in this case, it's a little bit more thriller-esque and less action-focused and less sort of genre-focused, like in the Blade Runners and the Apocalypse Nows and the Star Wars, of course. But what I think is also sort of critical about this period is that he still extends that sort of Indiana Jones persona, in the sense that he's playing doctors in both something like Frantic and The Fugitive. So he still has this sort of relatability, that believability. He's not going into these ultra extreme action scenarios. They're all grounded, they're all realistic. They're much more like thrillers, action thrillers in many regards, where things sort of fits him better as he sort of confronts his older age, but also in terms of these sort of action 90s thrillers of that decade. And then he tries to sort of extend it on into the 2000s with something like K-19 The Widowmaker, or even something like Hollywood Homicide. But this is his last sort of period here. I'd probably say from like 86 to 96 maybe, of that period of the sort of older action star, still that reluctant hero, but less of a sort of a sex symbol, less of a sort of cynical wise ass, and more of a sort of begrudging, moralistic man of morals and justice. But then, talking about the defining role in this period, I have to go with The Fugitive, because how could you not? In many ways, I think it's actually an underrated movie star performance, because Tommy Lee Jones has a sort of big, showy kind of a role, but very few people, I think, could have made this movie work had it not been Harrison Ford, because if you think about the movie, it truly is a movie star test in the same way The Martian is a movie star test for Matt Damon, because for the most part, Matt Damon is acting opposite no one else. In the same way, with this movie, Harrison Ford oftentimes is by himself, and that's a real testament to just wanting to be with him, wanting to see him think and get through problems and problem solve and interact with few people in many regards, just because he's such an interesting actor at that, which is an underrated skill. Which is, when we talk about the difference between an actor and a movie star, oftentimes in the most basic sense, you'd think of like an actor as transforming, being different to different characters in each movie, whereas a movie star for the most part has a persona and plays into that persona. And Ford, I definitely think, is a little bit more the latter, is more the movie star, and The Fugitive is a great example of that, because we just want to hang out with him, because we know that he is sort of charming and funny, but we also know that in this case he wasn't the killer of his wife, so we have to figure out who did it, and we're with him on that side. That sort of relatability is something that's hard to come by, but I think it's combined with that sort of mix of charisma and genuine, realistic kind of believability. And I think Ford is also really helping the pace of this movie in terms of keeping things excited and frustrated, and he's always out of breath, and he's always trying to think and jerry-rig something at the last second. And his sort of ability to show that frustration, or show that sort of pace, and keep that pace up within many of the scenes, and that sort of restlessness that he's able to bring, does so much to add to the overall speed and momentum of the film, and that's sort of a thing that we often forget when we're talking about directors or movies. It's like, well, how much does the actor actually bring just something like the pace of the film, the rhythm of the film? I think Ford here is a classic example of that. But a great movie, The Fugitive, talked about many times, and a classic sort of movie of this sort of chapter, where the first chapter is very genre based and the second chapter is very much Harrison Ford is the movie star based. But then the third chapter, I'm going to call this chapter The Return, because after his sort of leading action man stars fizzle out with movies, like I said, with K-19, the Widowmaker, 2008, he starts to revive his characters, does another Indiana Jones movies. Then he starts to, does only a couple movies. Then 2015, he does Star Wars The Force Awakens. Then a couple years later, does Blade Runner 2049. And these sort of three pivotal franchises he's gone back to. And even still, there's a fifth Indiana Jones movie coming back with Harrison Ford reprising his role as Indiana Jones. So there is this sort of idea of coming back and returning to sort of the franchises that he once established. Because for the most part, his career is not filled with awards and acclaim. He's only nominated for one Oscar. Oftentimes, he's always looking at where Hollywood is. He sort of did the genre stuff of the 80s, which was very popular in that decade, and then did the action thrillers and movie star focused of the 90s. And then now in the sort of 2000s and 2010s has returned back to these sort of remakes, these reimaginings, these prequels. These are the type of movies that ultimately resonate with him. And while I'd love for him to work with a Paul Thomas Anderson or Quentin Tarantino, ultimately I think that that's just not necessarily in his nature. And he's always interested, particularly as we see this last chapter, of what do audiences like, what is Hollywood sort of interested in, and if these are the movies that get made that allow me to be a movie star and be at the center of the poster and make a lot of money and be culturally relevant, then I'll do that. So now jumping into the defining role of this chapter, I ultimately went with Star Wars The Force Awakens. Once again, sort of returning to a franchise in this one. While it's maybe not the best of his sort of return to the franchises, I do think it is most successful in sort of capturing Harrison Ford as a movie star. Once again, capturing that youthful energy that he had in those early movies. And sometimes he can be a little bit cranky in his Chapter 3 roles. Sometimes he's been accused of not trying or not getting sort of 100% effort. He does sort of find sometimes he's a little bit sleepy in some of his roles, but not in this one. I think he is very energetic. He does fit sort of the youthful energy of the film. He is sort of resigned to the old man kind of a part, but does so with excellent craft, and in the sense that he is cynical about things and a little bit over things, but he's still very much passionate about defending his time and his era and the accomplishments that he did, and versus these sort of young kids. And for a movie star, he is sort of surprisingly generous with his other sort of younger co-stars. That he could have been I'm Han Solo, I'm the best part of this franchise, I'm going to sort of take over the movie. And he doesn't really. He plays very well with the younger members of the cast, allows himself to be the butt of the joke, the sort of old man in many instances, and works, has great chemistry with those younger actors. Plus, if you sort of buy into the emotional connection of the film and that arc, he is really at the center of it. It does have both the sort of fun Han Solo, sort of sly, witty scenes, but then also has the emotional connection with the Kylo Ren and that sort of father-son duo. So there is a strong connection there, and Harrison Ford, once again, taking out the sort of old jersey, putting it back on without to sort of skipping a beat. It really is fantastic in the movie. And now here we are at the defining feature, trying to understand what is that connective tissue between all of the Harrison Ford movies. And to me, I sort of came up with the definer of the reluctant hero. And why I think that's an interesting sort of statement, and why it is sort of an encapsulation of him as a movie star, is because regardless of the different types of genres he's in or the different types of roles he's playing, he's almost always a reluctant hero. He's sort of an everyman kind of a hero, but he's always a guy who is either sort of the wise ass, the sort of too smart for this guy, or he is the sort of over it, I'm tired, I'm too old for this kind of a guy. But regardless, he is always the hero. Even though he doesn't always want to be the hero, he knows what's right, and at the end of the day, he does go through it. Those are the types of archetypes and characters that he plays. Now, why does he play those archetypes? Well, because it executes and allows him to show two really key things that he's very good at: humor and restlessness. Humor, on the one hand, we can see him in Working Girl or Morning Glory being quite funny, but then sort of the restlessness element is a little bit more prevalent in a movie like Mosquito Coast or Blade Runner. But throughout his sort of movies, he always has that sort of combination and two things he's very good at, and that's why the sort of reluctant hero is so apt, I think, in terms of describing the type of characters he plays, because those are the sort of modes that he executes very well. And he really is one of those great actors, particularly with his growls and scowls. And we talked about earlier about the pace that adds to a movie, but in terms of just creating an everyday sort of likable character, Ford is great at sort of doing that mode of being the guy that doesn't really want to be there, but is ultimately going to do it at the end of the day. And I think more than any other person we've covered on this show, he is a sort of consummate movie star. Because, I think it's telling that throughout his entire career, he's only been nominated once for an Oscar, but despite that, he's connected to so many intellectual properties and movies that have done very well. And you can't talk about sort of modern day movies without talking about Harrison Ford in one way or another. So he has his landscape and sort of his impact there, despite him not being super involved in the award side. And I think that's just because his nature as a performer isn't necessarily transformation, which is so often respected in the Academy Awards. Are you able to remove your sort of persona? Harrison Ford's a guy who actually sort of leans into his movie star persona. You're there for a Harrison Ford movie, and you know what that is, and you're going to do that, and you're excited for that. And he's sort of got it all. He's charismatic. He's got good looks, but he's not sort of so beautiful and godlike that he doesn't feel like a real person. He does feel sort of like a regular guy. He's got that charismatic thing. He's willing to do genre movies. He's one of those guys that is a rare breed and is a sort of traditional movie star, which is why he's sort of spawned so many of these franchises. And he is a guy that I think would work in any era, probably would work at any time, just because he's got the classic combination of, if you were to build a movie star, I thought probably would build Harrison Ford. Good looking, charismatic, funny, can do action, can also sort of deliver some serious intimate moments, kind of a little bit meta in the sense that he has restlessness and that sort of humor that he's able to combine, so that he's sort of in on the joke and he knows that this is kind of a crazy idea, but he's going at it anyways because he has that sort of moralistic justice in him. He's a great movie star, and while I wish he did a few more roles, like a 42 or even like a Witness or something like that, he is still an actor with an incredible career, and one that I knew I had to cover because of his imprint throughout Hollywood, especially that sort of later half of the 20th century. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on your favorite Harrison Ford movies. Blade Runner, do you like sort of the new one versus the old one? The new Indiana Jones versus the old ones? Do you like the Star Wars most recent trilogy? Any of that kind of stuff related to Harrison Ford, I'd love to hear in the comments down below. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.